Good evening, everyone. This is your host, author Nodella Sakajuwea Jordan, coming forth with another broadcast on Intimate Talk. My guest tonight, or my guest host tonight, will be Troy Bryant. So I'm going to wait for him to tune in on Facebook and I'm going to plug him in. But tonight we are going to go to a discussion about spiritual intimacy because I believe that is the foundation of all intimacies because of who God is and the fact that he is a spirit, therefore intimacy started spiritually. So I'm going to give him a few minutes to tune in as well as others to join. In the meantime, please listen to this nice instrumental music in the background. All right. Also, if you have not purchased a copy of The Intimate Place, My God, My Man, Myself, I want to encourage you to please go to my website at www.nsjministries.com. There you can purchase a copy of my book. It also comes with a bookmark. And if you want it autographed when you are placing your order, please make a note saying that you would like an autographed or signed copy. It is a little cost to that, but it'll be worth it because it's a great book. So once again, if you have not read my book or if you haven't even heard of my book, The Intimate Place, My God, My Man, Myself, you are definitely missing out on a treat. And once again, I want to encourage all of my um, listeners tonight to go to my website at www.nsjministries.com and order you a copy. My book makes a great gift. I've had many people who purchased multiple copies, purchased them as a gift, and those who were a recipient of my book as a gift were very pleased to receive the book. Once again, my book is for both men and women. It's for Christians and non-Christians alike because intimacy affects us all, and intimacy was created for all of us. And my book also can be used in a group discussion. If you are interested in discussing my book in a group setting, I have created a lesson plan, and I would be more than happy to send you the lesson plan so you can, just have a fulfilling discussion, or you can create your own questions, either or. But one way or the other, my book makes a great book for group discussion also. So I'm just still waiting for my guest co-host to tune in before I get started. So continue to enjoy this music in the background. All right, so I'm going to get it started a little bit, and hopefully, my guest co host will be tuning in momentarily. I am a very punctual person, so some everybody not quite as punctual as some people. So I just want to give you a little introduction or a brief introduction of my book once again, and um, so this book was inspired by my personal experiences, reflection on my relationships with God, my man, and myself as well as family and friends. But also, my book was inspired by when I would attend church services. I saw those who were in attendance struggling to be intimate with a God whom they said they knew. It really bothered me to see a struggle that shouldn't be there. Then, when I look at the relationships today compared to when I was growing up, they're not quite the same. And I believe the missing component is intimacy. In my book, I am identifying the 5 types of intimacies, which are spiritual, mental, emotional, verbal, physical, and sexual. And I separate physical from sexual because you can't have physical intimacy without it being sexual. Being honest with ourselves, all intimacy, spiritually, mentally, emotionally, verbally, and sexually or physically, we all have struggled in these areas. And so the purpose of my book is to help us to get back to that place of being able to enjoy true intimacy that's not based on sex. Many of us, we grew up believing, according to society, that sex is the only type of intimacy that there is. And my book shows that sex is not the only type of intimacy. Also, I identify each one's purpose and how they can bring fulfillment in our relationships. My hope is that both men and women will find the intimate place, my God, my man, myself, a tool to reflect on, to bring greater understanding on this subject and on your past, present, and future relationships. Until we incorporate intimacy in our relationships will not always be as fulfilling as they should be and as we desire them to be. God created us with intimacy, and as Christians and non-Christians, we should not shun this characteristic. So intimacy is not about the fact that we're Christians or believers, but intimacy was created before we got into identifying ourselves as Christians. We cannot run from intimacy. We cannot wash it off, or bury it. Despite the fact that it is part of our spiritual and natural DNA, intimacy is a subject not spoken of often or freely. And even yesterday, as I was meeting with a gentleman from my job regarding work, him and I was talking, and so he asked a little history about me, and I told him about my book, and he seemed to be very excited about it. I shared with him my second book that's about to be released, Sassy, The Perfect Life. And I was sharing with him that even though our meeting was professional, we were still experiencing a moment of intimacy that was not sexual at all. There was no sexual connotation whatsoever about our moment of intimacy. Even though, once again, it was professional in a business meeting, because we shared some personal information about ourselves that brought it into a more of an intimate type of setting. And trust me, when this young man left, I give you, my conversation with him impacted his life. So I'm definitely looking forward to hearing from him. So furthermore, my desire through this book, or through my book, is to enlighten every reader that we have a gift that none of God's other creations have to this magnitude. Yes, when we see animals, yes, they have their moments of having sexual relations or sexual encounters, but it's still not in the manner in which we experience it. And because we were created in a more superior type manner, our form of intimacy is more unique than those of an animal. Having misunderstood intimacy myself, writing this book has helped me to reach a higher level of understanding and gain knowledge of my relationship with my God, my man, and myself. Though this book references scripture throughout, because I am a Christian, it is for anyone who is seeking for answers on being intimate. Everyone is on a different level of understanding intimacy, but not one source has an absolute answer except God. And so I put that statement in there because I know there are other authors out there who have written books regarding intimacy, but I'm sure they have not written it in the manner in which I wrote it, or otherwise I would be charged with infringement or plagiarism. And so, in the midst of me writing, I asked the Father, I said, well, what if I said, I don't want to plagiarize nobody else's works? And so the Holy Spirit really began to help me to understand the fact that the Father gave this desire to me to write this book. There was no way that I could plagiarize anybody's works. Excuse me, I just want to turn the music down a little bit. There was no way that I could plagiarize anybody's works. So I began to write the book. And the unique topic is the intimate place, my God, my man, and myself. And so there's three main chapters. And the first chapter, of course, it starts with God. Why? Because intimacy starts with God. He is the one who created it. And then I talk about my man, and I write my man because I am a woman. And I just basically encourage men, when you're reading the book, just flip flop it. Just say, instead of saying my God, my man, myself, it's my God, my woman, myself. And I use the terminology man, even though I'm using it synonymous with a husband, or you can, or it's used synonymous with a wife. I use the word man only because, once again, I am a woman and I do date men, or I date men at one point in time. But that I don't want to get off on that. And then I talk about intimacy with and for ourselves. And so tonight I want to talk about and focus on spiritual intimacy. And in my first chapter, the first subchapter is the unveiling of intimacy. And I call it the unveiling of intimacy because I want to go into a conversation. This isn't a Bible study teaching. This is a conversation that I will be having as soon as my co-host joins me, regarding intimacy, and to discover intimacy, to find out, where did intimacy come? Why was intimacy created? For who was intimacy created? And to just have a better understanding of also now reaching a point of encouraging those watching to start incorporating more moments of intimacy, because my desire ultimately is that we move from a place of only having moments of intimacy to having a life of intimacy, because we've had so many moments of intimacy. We want to eventually get into a life of intimacy, which means that you will no longer have to truly give thought of to have a moment of intimacy, but it will happen naturally, all because all the moments that you had to have moments of intimacy, you're now moving into a place, or you've now moved to a place of having a life of intimacy. So tonight, I don't know where my co-host is, but I'm going to continue on. So tonight, once again, I'm talking about spiritual intimacy, and I want to talk about the unveiling of intimacy. So my first question is, where did intimacy come from, and who was it created for? Intimacy was created by God. And in studying the Bible, one can draw inference that God's desire all along was to create intimacy in general for mankind. And it was to be part of relationships, not just between him and man, but also husband and wife, as well as family and friends. Now, when we read the word God, we don't see where the word intimacy is necessarily used between Adam and Eve, but yet, once God created Adam and Eve, there were moments of intimacy. Once again, not just about the sexual intimacy, because before they even got to the sexual intimacy, spiritual intimacy existed first. Looking at the 5 types of intimacies, there is only one that is a vehicle of expression with words. The others are all action words. The ones that are action words is verbal, emotional, mental, and spiritual. All of those are action. I'm sorry, I have it backwards. Sexual is the only physical intimacy, but all the others are non-physical action types of intimacy. Once again, you have spiritual, you have mental, you have emotional, and you have verbal. Now, I wrote them in that specific order for a particular reason, because as I began to think about each one of the types of intimacy, I'm not sure what's going on with my broadcast again tonight, but I'm having issues. But there was a particular reason why I wrote all of the types of intimacy in the order in which I wrote them. So once again, I started with the spiritual intimacy because spiritual intimacy is the foundation of all intimacies. But then when you move from the spiritual intimacy, it takes a mental thing. You go into the mental intimacy, because when God thought first to create intimacy. God thought first for the mental, for us to have intimacy. Then he felt emotions. He felt to have intimacy. And then you have your verbal intimacy. So after you have the spiritual intimacy, which originates with God, you then go into the mental, then you go into the emotional, and then you go into the verbal, where you actually speak. You have conversations, which are often moments of intimacy. And like I said, even as I was meeting with the young man yesterday, we was having a verbal moment of intimacy. And so the reason why I wrote them in that order is just as I explained, is because of our thinking process, if you will. If you think about the thinking process, or if you think about our process, how we process things, usually there comes a thought. Then there comes the mental, which is the mental, sorry. There comes the thought, the mental. Then you move into the emotional, your feelings. And then you move into the expression of what you thought and what you feel. So you go into the verbal intimacy. You speak. And then you go into the physical, which once again, I'm not talking about the sexual, but you go into the physical intimacy, which some people like to cuddle. Some people like to hold hands when they're walking or when they're sitting. Some people just like to hug, some people like to snuggle. But my point of view is that the sexual part of intimacy is the last that takes place, because it's a culmination of the other 4 types of intimacies. So I listed 5 types of intimacy in my book, and I do count physical and sexual as one, because they're both physical. Although, once again, you can't have physical intimacy without the sexual aspect of it. So let me move on. Once again, I'm still looking for my co-host, and I'm not sure of where he's at, but okay, I'm going to move on anyway. So once again, looking at the 5 types of intimacies, there is only one that is a vehicle of expression with words. The others are all action words. Why do so many of us still today associate intimacy primarily with sex? Because we continue to feed into the philosophy of society that you cannot enjoy a time of intimacy unless sexual. And that is not the case. And the only way that we will stop thinking that way is we got to change our thought process. We got to look at, well, when have I had intimacy that was not sexual? And so these are some of my questions tonight, once again, that I was supposed to ask my guest co-host. So I'm going to ask this first question. What do you identify as intimacy? Because if we go according to the world's definition or the world's point of view, it's all going to be sexual. It's all going to be sexual. However, for those who are abstaining from being sexually active, from being in a sexual relationship, so what? They can no longer enjoy having intimacy? Absolutely not. This is what the point of my book is, to get us out of that mindset of thinking the only type of intimacy that we can truly have, or the only fulfilling type of intimacy that we can truly have, is sexual intimacy. And so further along in my book, I talk about, so what happens between a husband and wife if one of them is unable to be sexually active? So does that now mean that they can no longer have a time or an intimate relationship that's not sexual? And so if they married based on only sexual relations of intimacy, then it will probably hurt their relationship. But if their relationship was built on non-sexual intimacy, then in the moment when one of them is unable to be sexually intimate, then the relationship will actually become stronger and it will remain intact. So my second question is, can you recognize an unsolicited moment of intimacy? Yesterday for me was a prime example with this young man that I met with. It was an unsolicited moment of intimacy because, as I said, we began to both talk a little, give a little background about ourselves personally, and then we started talking about the business aspect of our meeting. So we actually had an unsolicited moment of intimacy. It was verbal intimacy. And I shared with him is that how a lot of people are, for whatever reason, uncomfortable with even speaking the word intimate or intimacy. A lot of people, they shy away from it. They're ashamed of it. But this is who we are. This is a part of our character. This is a part of, I like to say, our DNA, because many of us, we desire to have some form of intimacy. Whether it's spiritual, mental, emotional, verbal, physical, or sexual, we all at some point desire to have an intimate relationship with someone. And let us also remember the definition of intimacy. It has nothing to do with sexual relations. It actually has to do with relationships in general, forming friendships, forming close bonds. And many of us, when I was growing up, that's what we would do. We formed very close bonds where we would say, oh, that's my sister, or that's my cousin, or that's my uncle, or that's my aunt. Why? Because even though we did not know at that moment, we was actually identifying a close relationship in Latin as intimacy, but that's what we was doing when we would say somebody's our relative who's not biologically related to us. So when I was growing up, we actually had many moments of intimacy and didn't realize it or didn't know to identify it as intimacy, but none of it was sexual. And so once again, I just want my book to help us to get back to the original place with intimacy that God intended. We shouldn't be afraid to have moments of intimacy with the same sex or with the opposite sex. We shouldn't be afraid to have moments of intimacy. We shouldn't be ashamed or embarrassed or afraid to talk about the word intimacy or even talk about being intimate. And even as I shared with a young man yesterday, after we introduced ourselves and we started talking, I said this is a prime example of us sharing a verbal moment of intimacy. And he had this look of, wow, you're right. Based on what intimacy is, he was like, you're absolutely right. So I'm trusting that what I shared with him yesterday will not only help him personally in his life of intimacy, but in his relationship, because he said he did have a girlfriend. So I'm hoping that sparked something in him to make him want to purposefully start having moments of intimacy with his partner, and it's not focused or surrounded only on sexual intimacy. All right, so question 3 is, what is your reason for wanting to be intimate? Everybody have their own reason for wanting to be intimate. Some people, they don't want to be lonely. Some people, they like the person not in an attractive manner, not that one just yet, but just in terms of a friend. They may say, oh, they he or she, oh, they make a nice friend, or they're a cool person. I wouldn't mind being friends with them. But then also, wanting to be in a relationship. So everyone has their different reason for wanting to be intimate with someone. And even for yourself, when I want to be intimate with myself, there are different things that I do as well as other people. Once again, you may not characterize it as intimacy prior to this video, but now that I'm sharing it with you, you can now actually identify when you want to go to the movies just by yourself. Call that an intimate moment. Don't say, well, I just want to go to the movies because I felt like going. No, you felt like having a moment of intimacy with yourself. Or you go out to eat to a restaurant by yourself. No, I didn't just go out to eat because I wanted to eat, but I went to the restaurant because I wanted to have an intimate moment with myself. Or you may go for a jog, you may go for a walk. You didn't just go for a walk, you didn't just go for a jog, but you wanted to have an intimate moment with yourself. Now, when you say, well, I went jogging with my sister, or I went jogging with my significant other, or I went jogging with my best friend, now you're saying you want to have a time of intimacy with someone else. And when you do that, that's actually a double, if you will, blessing, because while you're having a time of intimacy with another person, but you're still also having a time of intimacy that's geared towards yourself. You just decided to wanted to share that time with someone else. So we all have our reason for wanting to be intimate. And I want to also inject this, is that there's no right and wrong answer to any of my questions. My questions are simply to bring awareness to each of us, to help us to identify, when I do want to be intimate, why do I want to be intimate? When we are able to identify, this is why I want to be intimate, I believe it'll be more successful. I believe it'll be more fulfilling. But to have it and then you can't explain it, it leaves somewhat of a void. And I just really believe that when we say I want to be intimate, when football season come on, I want to have intimate moment watching football. Why? Because I love football. I'm not just having an intimate moment with football because there's nothing else on TV, or because if I have company, that's what they want to watch, or anything like that. But it's more because I want to have a moment of intimacy, and I want to do it watching football. Now, I could also want to have a moment watching a favorite television show. I could have a moment of, once again, listening to music, or going for a walk, or going to get something to eat. but I've learned to identify, why do I want to have an intimate moment now? Or why do I want to do this to have an intimate moment? Because when we are more conscious about when we intentionally set up times to be intimate with ourselves and with others, once again, you'll get more fulfillment out of it than just feeling like you're going through the motions or not even understanding it and you didn't get out of it what you want. How many of you have gone somewhere with someone and you really didn't want to go, but you went anyway because they kept saying, oh, come with me, come with me. But if you had identified saying that I didn't want to go because it's not going to be an intimate time for me, but I'd rather do this instead, then you would not have gone, or you would have made the situation to where you could have benefited from it in an intimate manner. Okay, so my next question is, can a person be selfish with intimacy? I say yes. And I say yes because it depends on their purpose for wanting to be intimate. Some people are selfish in general. So if we can be selfish in other areas of our life, then we can also be selfish when it comes to wanting to have our time of intimacy. What type of intimacy do you prefer? Have you identified the type of intimacy that you prefer? Some of us, for those of you who are in a relationship, sometimes you'll be have that intimate moment. And once again, I'm not talking about the sexual, just limiting it to the sexual intimacy, but I'm talking about any type of intimacy. Some of us, or for those who are in a relationship like that, you tend to gravitate towards what the other person wants at that time of intimacy. And they may want a time of intimacy by watching their favorite movie. But you may say, well, I want to go to dinner. And so I also advise in my book, when you come to a crossroads like that, both of you need to compromise. There's nothing wrong with watching his show or her show first and then going out to dinner, or going out to dinner first and then coming back watching their favorite show, or if they want to go to the movies or go bowling or roller skating. So you need to identify the type of intimacy that you prefer. Like I said, there's 5 types. You may not want all 5 at the same time. And when you identify the type that you prefer, you will be more conscious to make sure that you have more times of that particular type of intimacy, as opposed to, let's say, you prefer mental intimacy, but you find yourself always in verbal intimacy. So your mental intimacy may not get fulfilled because you're in a setting with someone where they're only focused on verbal. So their preference of intimacy may be verbal and yours may be mental. And some of you may say, well, what is the difference between verbal and mental? Because verbal is what you think of. Your verbal intimacy comes from your mental intimacy, from your mental thoughts, which is mental intimacy. But when you find more fulfillment in the thought process as opposed to the verbal process, which I'll get into as the broadcasts go on, to show you how to be successful in having spiritual intimacy. My time of intimacy is, I'll pull away and I just want to sit and listen to worship music and just sit in the presence of God. No conversation, no praying, no asking him for anything, but just sitting there listening to the music and also thinking about his goodness and thinking about all the things he's done and thinking about his creation. Sometimes I'll look out the window. One of my coworkers She says, every time I come into the kitchenette, I always see you looking out the window. You love looking out the window because across the street, even though there's a lot of buildings, there's also trees. But I look at how the buildings were designed. And then when the trees are in full bloom, I look at the different types of leaves, and for some of them, they have flowers on. So I look out that window because there was always something that attracted me. And at first, I didn't realize it. I would just go to the window and I would just look out the window because I would also see the cars coming and going in and out. I would see people going in and out of the building. But when she brought it to my attention, looking out the window, it also brought me a sense of peace as well. And so, once again, it is important that we identify the type of intimacy that we also prefer. And lastly, as I come to a close, what type of intimacy have you developed? Out of all of the types of intimacy, once you identify the type of intimacy you prefer, it's not only enough that you identify it, but you then must begin to develop it, or otherwise it will remain in that undeveloped or underdeveloped state, and you're still not going to get the fulfillment out of it that you can get out of it if you develop it. So I don't know what happened to my guest co-host tonight, but I do hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast of Intimate Talk. Tonight's discussion was spiritual intimacy, and I was basically just recapping the unveiling of intimacy in general. And it will help us as I continue with these broadcasts to understand the mindset of God when he first thought to create intimacy. We weren't even creating it, but he had already determined that once he created us, that he was going to place within us that desire to be intimate, because he desires to be intimate. All right. So I'm just going to read through the questions again, and hopefully I will get some feedback. Please answer these questions in broadcast even after it ends. Please submit your questions to me even on the broadcast. So my first question is, what do you identify as intimacy? My second question is, can you recognize an unsolicited moment of intimacy? What is your reason for wanting to be intimate? Can a person be selfish with intimacy? What type of intimacy do you prefer? And last, what type of intimacy have you developed? Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope that some feedback, and please feel free to also offer suggestions, submit your questions of things that you would also like for me to bring out in these broadcasts. My book, it has a lot of information in it, so I'm sure that I probably covered it in my book, but I'm just going to work my way through my book a little bit. My broadcasts also, they will not always be scripted. There will be questions, but with my guest co-host, I just want to also afford them an opportunity to just, for us just to have a discussion. That's why it's called Intimate Talk and not Intimate Teaching or Intimate Study, but it's Intimate Talk, where we just want to talk about intimacy. We want to talk about the different types of intimacy, and even talk about our experiences with intimacy. So this is your host, author Nodella Sacagawea Jordan. Once again, I want to thank you for all of those who have tuned in and listened to the broadcast. I want to encourage you to please share the broadcast even after it ends. And also, don't forget, go to my website, www.nsjministries.com, to get your copy of The Intimate Place. Have a great evening.